We are rolling.
Okay, so look to the camera and just say your name, please. I know it's nerve-wracking. Go ahead. You're first.
Simon.
Roger.
Yelena.
Beatrice.
Steven. Zach.
Thank you. All right.
So, are we ready?
Are we ready? Is the tape on?
Almost ready.
Almost. Hold on, Roger. Hold on.
Rolling.
I don't know why you're here. Let me tell you. Okay. So first of all, I want to thank all these students for coming and joining this conversation, and I also want to thank the Bard Publications Office for putting it together and inviting me to come here and host. As I understand it, the idea here today is for us to have a conversation about what some Bard students are making of some very interesting, sometimes troubling, sometimes exciting developments in a rapidly changing and confusing world. So I'd like the 5 students here around me to introduce themselves, and instead of just giving sort of your basic credentials, it might be fun to tell a story. Hannah Arendt said that all pains and sufferings are bearable if you put them into a story. So we're going to have a panel. Panels are often difficult. Let's make it bearable. Tell us a story about how you came to Bard. I think everyone here has a very different story about how they got here. So I'll start on my left, and we'll go around. Or actually, we'll go around that way. So Simon, could you tell us how you came to Bard? Keep it somewhat brief and introduce yourself to us.
Sure. My name is Simon, and I'm studying politics here. And that's not originally what I wanted to study. I wanted to study engineering. But so it's a bit of a shift from that. But I went to this wacky kind of high school that kind of changed my viewpoint when it came to things, and I thought politics was a lot more important for me to learn because I wanted to, I don't know, had all these humanitarian tendencies sort of instilled, and I wanted to do something good and great. What was good was that I got a nice scholarship to go here, and I really liked. I mean, the one thing I knew about Bard was the fact that they're very politically engaged or active, and so that's why I came here, and it's been useful. It's been good that I've been.
Great.
Sure. So I'm a senior, also majoring in politics, and actually my story sort of goes back even further than when I first got to Bard, right before I was thinking about going to Bard, because my older brother actually attended Bard, and he first came to Bard in 2005, and interestingly, he was the inaugural class of the conservatory. He was the first conservatory students at Bard, played clarinet, and he graduated in 2010. So I've known about Bard. I've been up here even, right at the beginning of high school. So for years I've been at Bard. I've been coming up here with my family, and so it was always sort of an afterthought that when I got to applying to college, that Bard would be on the list of places. And that's sort of my story with that. My brother convinced me to apply, and everything he told me about this school was just motivating me to really come here. And then once I applied and I got accepted and I came up here, I said it felt right for me to be here. And I've, it's my 4th year. I think I've received an excellent education, and I'm glad I came.
Okay, great. We are too. You.
Yeah, so I actually transferred to Bard. I did 1 year at another school and came to Bard largely because through conversations with mostly with a friend of mine from high school who did go to Bard, realized that I was really looking for the kind of thinking and educational atmosphere that was going on here at Bard. So I was able to make the switch, and it's worked out really well. I really like the kind of really deep thinking that goes on and asking big questions and being able to talk with students who care as much about asking those questions as I do. It's been really great. Yeah, so I'm a senior now, so sadly leaving, but it's been very good.
Beatrice?
I came to Bard after my mom told me that my colleagues at the school where she worked were alumni, and she said that they were among some of the best people in the building. I'd also been a chorister for about 10 years at St. Bartholomew's Church in the city, and sang with James Bagwell a lot. And his wife was also an alto in the adult choir, and she was just someone I always looked up to. So it just kind of cosmically made sense that I would apply to Bard, and I'm a senior as well, studying human rights, and I'm really, really glad I've been able to experience what I have here.
Yeah, I am an international student, and I've sort of had no intention of coming back to the US after I'd been an exchange student in 11th grade. Living here for a year, I sort of I took a gap year after I finished high school and sort of wanted to stay closer to home. But during my gap year, I really realized that talking to a lot of my friends who had gone to US and to US colleges, that I was very attracted to the concept of liberal arts, of being able to explore a lot of my interests, a lot of different interests. So at Bard now I'm studying human rights and politics, but I've, for example, taken a lot of different literature classes that I feel like have really informed also my understanding of how societies work, how politics is made. And so for me, when I got my scholarship offer from Bard, I was actually very happy. I changed my mind like right then and there. I was like, wow, it's great to have this opportunity to do this and actually engage in this liberal arts thinking that allows me to explore a lot of different interests.
Okay, great. I mean, one of the things I hear, and I often hear from students, is that people came here for very particular reasons. Something about the college really attracted them. And whether it's music, in your cases, or your brother, or just that it had a wacky reputation of something along those lines. People come here because they think about it. At least that's, and we call the college a place to think. Hannah Arendt, who's buried here, and I run the Hannah Arendt Center, says that the way we have to go through life is to think what we are doing. She also said that crises, and when you have a crisis, it tears away facades and obliterates prejudices. We're going through a lot of crises right now. It can be a time that's scary, but it can also be a time that offers an opportunity to rethink where you're at. So there's a lot of crises in the world. There's terrorism, there's technology, that it seems to be changing the relation between man and machine. There's the economy. There's politics is in crisis, it seems. There's health crises. There's an environmental crisis. I'm wondering which of these crises most excites you, worries you? Which one are you most interested in? And how are you thinking about the world and some of these crises in your lives as you're about to graduate from the college? Maybe we'll reverse the order.
Yeah, I think one of the things that worries me the most when I look at my generation is the lack of political passion. I feel like a lot of the time what inspires us are apolitical ideas, so human rights or humanitarianism, and other forms of trying to make the world a better place. But I feel like we really need systematic change if it's supposed to be sustainable and supposed to counter a lot of these very diverse crises. We need to have a really engaged public, and that's the one thing that worries me the most, but that I'm also most passionate about.
So an engaged public.
Yeah, politically active, even youth, but also public in general, that is willing to go on the street, but also willing to organize their own campaigns and trying to make a system.
And so has the last year, with beginning in the Middle East, and then in Israel and elsewhere, and now in the United States, Occupy Wall Street, is this to you the answer? Is this happening? Are the crises unleashing the activism and the political passions that you say we need?
It's not the only answer, but I really hope it's a beginning. It's a beginning to wake people up and to show them that these opportunities are out there. Because I feel a lot of people are content nowadays to just sit at home in front of their TV or in front of the internet and be constantly entertained with sort of shallow ideas and not go out there and try to really challenge the way the system is run today.
Okay, we'll come back. Beatrice?
Yeah, I think a lot of my interests are very similar to Irina's. As I've been at Bard over the past years, I've definitely realized that as the way I think expands, a lot of the people in my community don't share with the kind of zeal that I've been able to develop about the world's issues. And I think that with things like Occupy Wall Street and the Arab uprising, it definitely gives a lot of people a reference point to think about the idea of a revolution and of kind of liberation. But I think it's important that they find a more kind of a meaning closer to their lives. A revolution solution kind of on a personal level that they can expand to their communities. So I think with the all the different crises that have been happening around the world, for me, I'm really interested in recasting something like human rights in a way that allows people to see it on an individual and even an interpersonal level, so that I guess the values and the principles that human rights espouses can materialize.
So your idea is to work for a kind of a human rights, a better protection of human rights around the world.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Should we have a conversation? Because Arena had, I'm just wondering what Arena had said she was worried about sort of the depoliticization of human rights. Is that something that worries you?
I think not so much, because I think, especially when you look to the African continent, it's the idea of human rights just provokes a lot of kind of political outcry, and on a cultural level, and especially on an economic level. So I think perhaps in America that's an issue and a challenge, but the entire continent has been grappling with how politicized the idea of human rights is. So I have these two frames of reference, and I think on one hand, that is definitely a concern, but when I look to the continent, there's so many issues that it's going to be important and integral to the realization of human rights, that a lot of Africans begin to realize what that means on an individual and interpersonal level.
Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the list of crises that you went through, I'll speak to, I think, what is I see them as very interrelated, I guess, and the question that's interesting to me is what's at the root of those crises, and what's why is it that in today we have a crisis with the environment, a crisis in political engagement, a crisis with technology. All of these things seem to be coming to a head, and I think it's because we're quickly realizing or not realizing that there's a problem in how we relate to our world, whether it's the world of other humans or in the natural world. I think thinking carefully about what it means to be in the world with other people, how do we engage politically with one another, sort of what you were talking about. Those are the kind of questions that I think are now having a space to get asked by people today, because there are these crises, and especially young people are starting to reimagine these things, and I think if there can be a turn toward as kind of political engagement, like you were saying, I think you were talking about bringing human rights into an interpersonal level. I think forming those kind of relationships and acting in the world in the ways that it seems like you're talking about are the steps. And it's also,
Can I ask what issues? Yeah. Towards what should we engage politically? Or is it more of a general political engagement?
I guess I think more about the kind of engagement that is taking place, and I think a lot of people, especially in this country, I don't know much about other countries, but see political engagement as kind of having their own political opinions, not necessarily discussing them with other people, and voting. And that's a pretty limited picture of what it means to be part of making the world in a political way. And I think the more that we can exchange opinions in a real debate kind of way, and have, I see the world this way, and I think this is what needs to be done. What do you think needs to be done? Can we work on this together? I heard a report on the radio this morning about how the reporter was in, I forget what city they were in, but talking about Congress and how right now, one of the funny things that they said was the idea of a communist takeover of the United States is more popular than Congress is right now, in polls that they've done. And, you know, people recognize that what's happening in Congress is not working, that it's not politics, it's something else. And so that we need to rethink what it means to be political. Yeah.
Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest crisis that we have today is the political crisis. And while it's depressing in many ways, I'm also optimistic in terms of what has been going on in the past year. I think that there has been maybe not a fundamental shift, but there has been, with the Arab Spring and now this Occupy movement, whatever the future of that might be, I think that we are seeing a shift in people's attitudes towards ownership of themselves within their own society and with their relationship between themselves and the government that is supposed to represent them. And, you know, we often use the terms, you know, freedom and liberty to describe, you know, these are values that, you know, all humans want for themselves in the future. But I think that instead of just lumping it into those terms, I think the biggest issue is ownership over our future. And it doesn't mean that you know, everyone has to run for political office or be involved to that extent. But what that does mean is that the government should be truly representing our interests and the future of our society, and that is not happening. Certainly not in our country right now, and certainly not in many other societies around the world. And so I think the political crisis has a lot to do with corruption. I mean, I think that when you look at sort of the campaign finance reform or the campaign finance legislation in our country, it allows certain interests to have a lot of power in our political situations, have a lot of power. They donate a lot of money, and that influences the people that run our society. And so I think the vast majority of Americans and other people around the world simply want to have a fair stake in the future of their society for themselves. So whether that's, you know, some parts of the Occupy movement, I think, espouse that, where we want clean elections, we want public financing of campaigns, so that if I run for political office, I don't have to spend most of my time getting money from special interests and corporations to have a fair shot of winning. And currently in our system, we don't have a system in place where you can run for political office and not have to raise millions of dollars to even be competitive. And that should not be the case. Any citizen should be able to run for office in a fair way without having to get this money from these people or these corporations. So I think that's the major political crisis right now, and that hampers all the other crises that you mentioned, the environmental crisis, the human rights crisis. They're all affected by how campaigns are funded and who really has influence in our political system. And if we don't solve the political crisis, I fear that many of these other crises will be unsolvable for a long time to come. But I am optimistic because I do see people coming up and rising up and demanding change. Is it going to happen very quickly? Probably not. But at least it's fostering a dialogue, that we can say, we'll come together and we'll talk about what we need to do for the future in a mass movement type of organization and move towards the future. And that's really, I think, the best thing we can do right now. So critics that say that it's not, that they don't have certain aims or it's not going in a very specific direction, I think that misses the point of what this movement's about, is trying to bring people together to try to have some ownership and stake in the future, which is not existent right now.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that. Sam?
I'm from Pakistan, and there, I think, to an extent, most of the crises that you've listed are more amplified than elsewhere, and I think that the list is longer when it comes to Pakistan. So I feel like the stakes are higher, which is why I'm studying politics in the first place. Out of the list that you've described, I think I've been compelled to believe that terrorism is the #1 threat, but I've been beginning to seriously doubt that for a very long time. I think there's a crisis of governance, and by that I mean globally there's a crisis of governance, because I feel there's this very there's a difference between what people think is best and what people think is the right thing to do, and there's and how that translates. Because whatever one might think of the United States being in the United States about U.S. government and how it works, and Congress and the executive or judiciary, and that this enshrinement of the Constitution and all those great values which Zach just talked about, they don't exactly translate into an international stage when countries talk to each other. And I think because Pakistan's been in such extensive dialogue with the United States, especially over the 10 years, I think there's a very, very different sort of interpretation of what American values mean and how they're interpreted in the world. For me, what's most important, I think, is that the crises that you mentioned are very global in scale. And yes, some countries are more effective than others, but I feel that there is a need for cooperation, and the way international relations right now works doesn't allow for that cooperation to exactly take place. Especially this big idea of sovereignty, trumping any sort of cooperation or any sort of. There's just this big distrust, and I think that's something to do with how Hobbes describes the world to be. I don't know. I hope not. But I think that might actually have something to do with this idea of truth, really. I mean, of knowing what the issue is and doing what is necessary to avert what the crisis is. And I think that's why there's a fundamental misunderstanding, I feel, when it comes to countries talking to each other about what is at stake. And I feel because that they have this misunderstanding, they're not going about the right way when it comes to this, whether it's Germany in the Euro crisis or whether it's talking about Afghanistan with Pakistan. I feel that if there's a bit more sincerity, a bit more honesty, and a bit more, a greater realization of how dire the issue is, then I think we could take a step forward into actually trying to come up with an idea to solve it. But I think the simple mistrust and skepticism which exists, especially when it comes to countries talking to each other, it doesn't allow for any kind of productive action or even dialogue to take place. And that's something which I think worries me more.
It struck me that at least 3 or 4 of you, maybe all 5 of you, to a certain degree, think the political crisis, the general overarching crisis, is underlying all the others: terrorism, the economy, politics, health. And I've heard a number of you say we need to get more involved, we need to rethink with some optimism, in the sense we need to be more international. I'm wondering, where you think the friction is in the system. Is it with government? Is it with corporations? Is it a cabal of some sort? Is there corruption? Or is it the voters? I mean, a lot of these countries we're mentioning are democracies, and there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of will to change things. And so I'm wondering where one fights, or how one fights, or how you want to fight. Is this an issue that you see as your personal issue? I mean, how many of you are going to see public service, public engagement, bringing zeal and political action back to politics as your calling for the next 5 years as you lead BART? Zach.
I do, again, getting back to the political crisis, I mean, I think the main problem, the main root of all of this is corruption. And I think that in our political system, there are genuinely good people in our political system. I think there are good-minded politicians that want to do good by their constituents and by our society at large. But what hampers it from the very beginning is how they have to, in terms of political survival, how they perpetuate their own political career. And that is done by having to raise lots and lots of money from certain interests. And, and people can say, well, I won't be affected by that influence coming into my own political campaign or my votes I take or things like that. But it's hard not to see how there's a conflict of interest in a majority of these cases where I'm taking X number of dollars from this interest and then I'm voting on something that is related to something that might help that interest where I'm getting money from. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case. So if we don't solve that, then I think it's going to be very hard for our political system to be sort of cleansed and free from that influence. I think that our politicians and people that actually make the laws for our country should be liberated in a sense, and they're not right now because of this, because of how their campaigns are financed and how they have to survive as a politician. And there are solutions to this. It's not, it's not impossible to fix this. But we need the will from the public to make sure that we pursue this. And with regard to your question about what we do after BARD, I mean, I've been involved in terms of public service. I've done some internships, and I've worked in the general field of public service. I've interned for members of Congress before. I do plan on entering public service in the future, and that could take many different avenues. And I'm applying to Teach for America right now. I might be a public school teacher for the next 2 years in one of the most impoverished areas of America, wherever that might be. And the reason that I'm doing it is because I feel that we sort of have a responsibility. I think most students at BARD and people that go to institutions like ours have an obligation and responsibility to give back to society at large. And that can take many, many different avenues, whether that's teaching, whether that's serving a nonprofit organization, whether that's doing things that can help improve society, given our education and given the opportunity to do big things. And so I firmly believe that, and I think my career, whether that's a legal career or education or in politics itself, that is sort of the trajectory of where I see myself in the future.
Does everyone agree, or do some people disagree about the question of corruption? Is corruption, in your opinions, where the problem is in our political system, or is there, or something else? Or you want to add to that?
I would disagree. I would think that I don't think it's corruption. I think it's the way that the debate is generally set up. I think it's this idea that partisanship is more important, and in a way it is. I think the sort of structural, at least within the political system, the sort of structural, furniture which is there, I think that it just compels people to act in a different way. If you've got elections coming for congressmen every 2 years, I think they'd be very, very interested in raising as much money as they can to win every election, and it's a perpetual campaign. So because it's a perpetual campaign, they've got their priorities differently. So I think it's essentially structural. Yes, I think the sort of moral decisions that politicians make when they're in power is very important. But I think when it comes to how the affairs of a presidential candidate matter more than any sort of substance, especially when it comes to the sort of things that you're supposed to be knowing. I think when that sort of trumps what you're supposed to know, I think the problem is what is valued in a politician, what a politician is expected to do. And I think that those ideas of those questions, I think, are very warped wherever you go. Not necessarily the United States. And I think because there are these different expectations, and sometimes, expectations which cannot be met in any way, that the politicians are compelled to be whatever the public wants it to be. For me, what's important because I see the issues, I think the idea is how to shape the debate and to talk about these sort of things and to sort of decide what matters more, which is why I think the role of the media is so important. Because I think the media is really one entity that sort of shapes debate, that sort of identifies what is important, what should be done, what could be done, and a great public forum for people to be discussing these sort of issues, especially when it comes to governments. Which is why I think they have a greater responsibility in shaping political and public debate. So that is why I think the way people talk about things is a lot more important, especially I think Occupy Wall Street is a very good case in point. Because I think simply the amount of ideas and because people have been talking about Occupy Wall Street so much that a lot of people have good ideas, and because people have been talking about Occupy Wall Street so much, I think people are becoming more political, which I think goes back to what Irina was saying, that it compels people to think about these issues which otherwise they wouldn't have been thought about. And that is why I think the media plays a responsible role in this, into making sure that people are talking about the things that actually matter. So that's why I think structural issues are a greater problem for me within any sort of political system, as opposed to any corruption.
And structural issues, you mean sort of the constitutional system? The way the partisanship, the idea of two parties.
Well, see, the thing is, people idealize democracy so much, but there are inherent issues with democracy when it comes to these sort of issues. Running for elections, for example. Election itself is a popularity contest, which does or might not have anything to do with the issue at hand. And I think some of them you can sort of step away from, and some of them you really can't. The idea of different parties, for example, I think is a necessary evil. But the greater issue is that the idea that issues are complex, that they need to be thought about intelligently, is lost because of partisanship and because there's this need to see the world in good and evil, black and white. And I think that is a greater issue because differing opinions, especially when it comes to the U.S., where you have the labels of liberal and conservative, and you add so many things to that one label where it's supposed to be an entire list of things that you should be if you're conservative. And I think that because it is like that, you lose the ability to think about issues in isolation. You have to be pro-gun, you have to be pro-life, you have to be pro-Israel if you're conservative. Where you don't isolate those issues and think about them in separation from everything else. And I think that is sort of the sort of systemic issues that I'm talking about.
And how do you see your next step? I mean, are you going to be continuing to think about these issues after Bard?
Well, I would have loved to be in public service, but that's sort of impossible in Pakistan right now, especially because of more than 1,000 political workers have been assassinated this year in just my city alone. So it's not something that I think is viable, at least metaphysically. But what I've been thinking about more than anything else is this idea of shaping the debate, and I think that's something which I can do. So that's why I think I'm really interested in journalism. And I think that if there are engaged citizens, they read, and if there are engaged citizens, they write for people who read. And I think that on either side, I think there's a lot to be said and there's a lot to be thought about. So it's that kind of shaping the debate, which is something that I think I'd like to participate in. So journalism is something that I've been considering as an alternative, although being the decision maker would have been preferred, but what are you going to do?
I resonate a lot with the things that Simon's saying. And I think a lot of what I've been thinking about in my education at Bard is like what it means to have a conversation and like what's going on in a dialogue between people. And like this idea of shaping the debate, I think is sort of, I feel like that's a more root cause of corruption. I see corruption very much as like an effect of a problem. Like corruption happened for a reason. And yes, it's a problem, and yes, like I totally agree that addressing, campaign finance would go a long way in improving the situation, but I still feel like there's that corruption is an effect, not necessarily a cause. And so the question of engagement, I've been thinking a lot about too, as I very much feel like my Bard experience was a step away from the world and sort of removing myself from the world to think about it and think about my place in it, where it's going to be. And as I'm preparing to enter back into it, I think one thing that I've gotten from my education is a real sense of the importance of genuine dialogue with someone, not as I'm a liberal, you're a conservative, or even if you break it down to the issue, even I'm pro whatever and you're anti whatever, but just still in that moment being open to actually listening to the person and hearing where they're coming from, why they have these set of views, and then being able to have a conversation about it, so that maybe at least you have some sort of commonality affirmed. You're not totally living in different worlds. It's even if you don't come to some sort of magical consensus or agreement, you're still engaged in the process of talking about the issues that are out there for debate. And I guess, like, well, I totally agree that media has a lot to do with it. I guess I feel like my education has more prepared me to enter into conversations with people in a more sort of genuine and substantive way than I feel like happens a lot in daily life.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of things that were said. I just sort of see the root cause for them somewhere else. And I believe that, I mean, for me, what is one of the major problems is how the mentality of the free market gets to run free. And I think that's at the core of why a lot of people aren't as engaged, aren't talking to each other, don't get a lot of the complex issues surrounding certain, problems. It's because when we look at the media, the mainstream media in this country, the problem is that a lot of what they do is also provide like infotainment in different ways. What brings them the most viewers is talking about some sort of celebrity or the affairs that a politician has, but not really about issues. And on the other hand, they have shareholders too. They don't want to threaten any interests that could maybe hurt wherever their money is coming from as well. And so the public isn't getting their information from the media. And on top of that, the public is very scared and they live in very insecure times for various reasons that for me also have to do with the free market. The idea that you graduate with a lot of debt from college, you have to work several jobs, you have to be very afraid to lose healthcare, there are barely any unemployment benefits. A lot of that creates for me, especially I think among young people, a climate of fear, where they don't really feel like they can stand up for their rights, and they can be engaged because they're constantly worried and they're constantly working. So I see that as part of the problem. And another thing is, you seem to suggest a bit that, I mean, conversations for me, that's a great idea. We have to challenge each other. We have to also work on the local level to engage people that are immediately around us, to think differently. But one thing I'm sort of suspicious of is the idea of bipartisanship, the idea that you constantly have to make compromises. Because I was very influenced by Arendt and this idea that we have a duty to judge in a way, and to be moral we have to judge and sometimes say, you know what, on this issue for me there is no compromise. I think this country should have a single payer healthcare system, and I'm not going to create something that is completely watered down and not as good in a sense.
And just to be clear, I don't see conversation as like consensus building necessarily, but just being able to express ideas, like how, you know, in a genuine conversation you would be able to say, no, we need a single payer healthcare system, without me sort of writing you off as a socialist or whatever. It would be, I guess it's an openness and feeling like you can make a stand, and that it's not about bipartisanship of can't we just compromise, because I think a lot of, who was I having? I was having a conversation about this with someone. A lot of the legislation that gets put out is done because it has to pass a very partisan Congress. So it's this sort of compromise of stuff that is just crap. It doesn't make sense one way or the other because it had to come out of this process of compromise. So I don't think, I don't see the role of debate and conversation as like coming to something we can all stay in our worlds and be happy with. You know, it's about learning to see other people's perspective and very much changing opinions. And I think that's something that is not okay in the political environment, you know, today. Is the minute you say, oh wait, I had this conversation with someone and I see things differently now, your political career is out the window because you're a flip-flopper or whatever. So there's a hostility towards something change your mind, or having conversations and debates really affect how you go forward, I think. But yeah, I get you.
Yeah, I think hostility is like a really good way to like think about why a lot of the different ways that people associate with one another, like different associations in different communities, kind of interact with one another the way they do. I'm thinking as I listen about Mississippi's like current situation and their history. I mean, because I spent the summer there, and they're 50th in a lot of things, and there's so many efforts on the ground by policymakers and religious leaders to kind of move away from such a a period of so much just kind of staying in kind of a negative environment, and at the tension that a lot of religious leaders and politicians see is that the associations that happen even before people get to the polls is kind of what delays the state from kind of finding ways to communicate and finding ways to engage in dialogue. So I'm really interested in seeing how those different associations can still look outside those boundaries and say, okay, like we want our children in these types of schools, but we're willing to allow these policies to help other community members who want to see these types of things happen in their communities.
I've heard a number of you speak about the media and education and corruption. In a certain way, Irina, I think, had and Simon, to a certain degree, had a more political, maybe, understanding in a certain sense. There's the old saying that Hannah Arendt used to write about, but Max Weber as well. To make an omelet in politics, you have to break a few eggs. Not a lot of breaking of eggs so far around the table. I'm wondering how many of you think some eggs need to be broken, and we can interpret that in different ways. I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. I mean, if you really think it's a crisis, what needs to be done? To quote Lenin. Go ahead.
No, yeah.
I mean, I certainly agree that some eggs need to be broken, because I do think there is sort of, if you want to call it corruption, it's a very institutionalized corruption. And I do think that there needs to be systematic change that will not come about through the normal election processes the way they have been happening now. I think the public needs to become needs to build up a lot more pressure. And I think if Occupy Wall Street is anything, that's what they're hoping to be, is to put a lot more pressure on politicians to be accountable to the people and not just to special interest groups or to making the free market even more free. And the freedom we get is the freedom to starve, the freedom to not have adequate healthcare. And so for me, I think there is, if we really want to change the way the system functions in the first place, in order for more people to be allowed into it, in order for more voices to be heard, in order for the media to present issues in a more complex manner, a lot of these things that we see as problems, I think there has to be a big mass protest that builds up pressure in different ways. And there needs to be a different culture of accountability as well, which is why I like that WikiLeaks in its own way broke some eggs and showed governments that they should be accountable to the great public too in their way.
So kind of transparency.
Yeah.
I mean, how far do you want to go with transparency? Should everyone's lives be on the internet?
But I don't think your representatives are your private lives. I mean, if you are a representative out there and you're making decisions on behalf of a whole country.
What about all the websites you visit?
But, I mean, I was more talking about WikiLeaks in the sense because
Well, yeah, but WikiLeaks is simply a beginning. Once the principle of WikiLeaks is out there for governments, why isn't it out there for politicians? Why isn't it out there for professors? Why isn't it out there for school teachers?
Because I think there is a huge difference between someone being a private individual, and I think their privacy should be protected, and someone acting as a representative of a government and as a representative of the people. And I think once you're acting as a representative, then this privacy shouldn't, in a sense, exist the same way, because these representatives need to be accountable to the people they're representing. But as a private person, I think privacy is extremely important. We shouldn't just be sold by Facebook or other websites to, again, corporate sponsors who just use these websites to monitor our consuming habits.
Like I say, you are, and you all use it.
Sure,
right?
we do.
And I don't know if all of you do, but some of us do. And I'm just wondering if that's part of, is it Facebook's fault? Is it the government's fault, or is it our fault? And I guess let's start there. Or is it all?
To a certain degree, I think it is our fault, but now the internet is becoming more conscious of these things. So I just accepted my invitation to Diaspora, which is a new social network that basically keeps information in the user's. The user basically still owns all of the information he or she puts out there. So it's an alternative social network site that was based on the idea of Facebook, looks pretty similar in a sense, but a lot of people are now joining that instead because they decide that this is probably better for them.
Anyone else want to talk about eggs?
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think we need to break some eggs. It's about time. And I think that, a way that we can do that is to, within our political system, to get people to start, and the word's used too often, but compromise and actually speak to one another in a rational way about, facts and objective ways of solving issues. And that was mentioned by a few people at this table before. We've never been as partisan ideologically as we have at this point in time, like ever before in our history. And there was a time where people from both sides of the aisle could come together and work on issues in a realistic way. But what's happened now, people can have their own political philosophies, and you absolutely should. And I don't like labels, but if you are more progressive minded or more conservative minded, whatever that might be, you can hold those values and those philosophies. But ultimately, our democracy, I think it's been fairly successful. We've existed for over 230 years. I think that's a pretty good measure of success. And with a democracy as large as ours, over 300 million people, it's going to get a little messy. There's not everyone in America are progressive. Not everyone in America is conservative. And you need people to work together to solve these problems. And people have just, whatever the causes of this trajectory might have been, the fact remains that we've been very politically, ideologically moved to the sides. We cannot work together, and we have to work together. And yes, ultimately that means people are going to have to give in to some things. I'm going to have to give up something I want. You're going to have to give up something you want. But we have to be looking at this as the greater good for the future of our own society, not only for our own country, but for the world, on many different issues. And so I think cracking some eggs means putting all the problems that we have personally with one another and ideologically with each other on the side, and actually sitting down and trying to compromise and get something done. And again, not for its own sake, not for the sake of saying, I want to be bipartisan, let's be bipartisan. No, it's saying, let's deal with climate change, and actually deal with it in a sensible, objective way, and figure this out, putting everything aside. Let's deal with our foreign policy, putting everything aside, and actually dealing with it one-on-one. And that is not happening right now, and that would be some eggs I'd like to see cracked.
I think fewer eggs need to be broken than I think they do, and than people generally think they do. I think if you look at the Middle East, for example, I think the situation had been going on for 30, 40 years with most of the dictators that were there, so I thought, okay, in that sense it's about time that they get rid of them. But I think as how the crisis is unfolding in Egypt, I think a lot of what needs to be done is a psychological/philosophical shift, as opposed to certain actions that need to be taken. I feel that certain countries, not the United States so much, need to have a better idea of what they want out of their government. So for example, I think when it comes to Pakistan, I think that the military-civilian sort of chasm that exists in Pakistan, that needs to be finished. But before you go and try to do that, I think there should be a lot of thought into what you want to take its place and how are you going to get it. Within the United States, I think again, more is required from that philosophical/psychological shift as opposed to any structural changes within how the democracy works. I think when it comes to climate change, as Zach said, I think if people think that, okay, first you need to accept that it is a problem, I think then you can go a long way in trying to solve it. So I think that's the basic thing that needs to be changed, as opposed to some people being fired or any sort of eggs that need to be broken. I think most of these issues, even in conversations such as this, I think the problem is that there needs to be a difference in the way people think about these things for it to move on somewhere. That's why generally when it comes to any sort of, that's why I think Occupy Wall Street is good, in that they're more interested in how they think about these things as opposed to doing what is necessary. But then what you expect to change of it is radically reduced as well, because so then the question isn't, to bring any sort of, to get bankers arrested or to get congressmen to pass legislation, and the issue becomes to ask how differently these sort of things can be thought about. When it comes to things like, say, the American-Israel relationship, when it comes to nuclear weapons, any issue, I think, needs to be thought about differently before people can consider what sort of action needs to be taken differently. And in that respect, I think not that many eggs need to be broken in. It's more of a internal process where people think about things differently. But then the question, which I'm struggling with myself right now, is how that shift comes about. And I think that's less to do with holding up banners or pickets or things like that, and more to do with contemplation.
Contemplation.
Yeah.
And the answer that I would give is, and I've been talking about it before, but just like those kind of changes happen when you talk to people, and come out of contemplation. Sure, it's talking with people and talking with yourself. It's
a dialogue.
It's a dialogue, and I right now I mean being the philosophy major that I am, I don't see how I don't see how any action or like legislative change. I don't know if I believe that actually. I feel like the contributions that I see myself making in terms of making change in the world are in the conversations that I have with the people around me, whether it's my family or members of my community. It's in how I start those conversations and being an agent of the kind of conversations that I think we've been talking about, and that's where I see my role. But
I'm just sort of suspicious that that's really where our great salvation lies, because I feel like even though that's very important, there is a reason why these issues aren't as clear as they could be. I mean, there are facts about climate change. There shouldn't be a debate. There are scientific facts out there. There are international treaties. There are a lot of suggestions by independent groups that have suggested for the big power states in the world what should change. The problem is that why are people not really aware of these facts, or why are they not registering these facts? And I think there is a reason, or why is, for example, the political process not acknowledging some of them and how important they really are. It's because I think a lot of people are benefiting from the status quo, and a lot of people benefit from being able to pollute the air and whatnot. So I think there is an idea that to keep people less passionate or sort of less aware of the facts, or to sort of make it about these ideological shifts of if you're conservative, you shouldn't really believe in, I don't know, that we need to do something about climate change because America is great and we need to trump over China, and to trump over China we need to have a lot of economic power, and there's a lot of that like nationalistic rhetoric or other sort of things that rouse passions and that are being, I don't know, broadcast over and over again in the media that keep the status quo in place, in a sense, that keep a big difference from being made because so many people are benefiting from it. That it's good for them to make people not that angry about it and say, this is why we need to do it, is because we need to have, I don't know, have the great American nation benefit from it, or you need us to be economically strong or something. So in that way facts are being denied through other stories, and I think there comes the idea of stories, we're coming back to the idea of stories, is that that's what, as people, we're being told. That's why we cannot process some of these facts and how important they really are. And maybe some of these stories can be challenged from the way we talk to each other, but I feel like they're so ingrained in the way we're being taught in school and the way the media presents facts to us that it's going to be very hard to just challenge them one-on-one. I think there needs to be some bigger political pressure.
I think you let people off the hook easily. I think being told is just one part of it, and I think you need a certain amount of volition from the people to believe what they're being told. And I think that's a different part of it, which is why I'm also skeptical of this idea of campaign finance. Because I think regardless of how much money Republicans spend, I know I'm not going to be voting for Herman Cain, regardless if he has like the most lucrative campaign ever. Similarly, I think when it comes to, I think every individual, especially one in society, has a responsibility to find out the facts for herself or himself. And I feel that when you say, okay, if you watch Fox, obviously you're going to be biased. I don't think that's true either, because I think I would give individuals enough responsibility to sort of discern the facts for themselves. And if they don't, then they should. So I don't think you can blame the powers that be, or whatever you want to call them, for this sort of indoctrination or this sort of nationalism. Because I think even with nationalism, I think it's an individual leap which an individual takes that says, okay, I love my country and I'm willing to do whatever it is for it, including killing other people or whatever. But I think there needs to be individual responsibility for that. So what I think would work is to shape whatever one can within society that they're able to. And as Stephen said, I think talking to as many people as possible and to sort of figuring things out for yourself, I think is the first step. Because how could you call yourself a responsible citizen if you haven't thought these sort of things through? And so that's why I think that's where it starts. And it is once you know exactly where you stand, and which is also liable for change all the time, that I think one realizes, okay, these are the things that obviously I cannot deal with. I cannot be the one passing legislation. Yeah, fine, I can switch the lights off in my house, but how is that going to avert climate change? It is at that point that you look at your government and talk about, okay, the problem again is that obviously the companies, especially oil companies or mining companies or whatever, they obviously think that they can continue with the status quo indefinitely. So they themselves are skeptical of climate change, and I'm very sure that if companies themselves knew that their companies wouldn't exist if they were underwater, literally and figuratively, that's when they would go like, okay, maybe we need to stop on our emissions. So the skepticism that's coming there, even if it is based off of a profit motive, I think would stop if they knew what they were doing. Because when they're destroying the world, they're destroying themselves as well. I mean, it's not just the Maldives which is going to suffer.
Can I respond really quickly? Just the first thing I want to say is there's definitely one group of people I wouldn't let off the hook, and that's BART students and people who are exposed to a lot of critical thinking and are being challenged. And for that, once you're already in that sort of environment, I feel like definitely you have a responsibility to think and a responsibility to challenge the general assumptions. But I do think we are pretty isolated from how a large part of the society lives their lives, and has to in a sense, because I do think they do not, being able to have the time to think critically and to spend this time is a privilege in a way. We have to acknowledge it as such. And it's a problem. I wish more people would be able to get a better education and enjoy the privilege to be challenged and to critically think about the world. But I cut them more slack because I don't think everyone has that possibility necessarily to be exposed to as many different opinions. And secondly, you mentioned about that maybe one day companies, in a sense, will realize that they themselves are going to be threatened by climate change. And that might be true, but I think there is a certain institutionalized logic where there isn't just one leader or one person that can realize something. It's an institution that runs on the idea of creating more and more profit, and is responsible to a lot of different individuals who would like their shares to rise. And so there isn't really somebody making a decision for, well, at some point in maybe 20 years, my company might be underwater, but today I have to still answer to my shareholders why they can't buy their second beach house somewhere. So in that sense, I don't think they necessarily are able to make these rational decisions about the future as well, because it's a lot about being accountable in the present and making more profit.
Interesting way to jump in here.
Yeah, just thinking about my responsibility as a BART student, having been in this environment, and what how far dialogue will take me in communities like in New York City, public housing. The thousands of people living on 2 or 3 blocks, and just thinking that they're inundated with ideas and representations of things that are supposed to be counter to their aspirations, and thinking that it has to be a full-on discourse and a constant one, because those dialogues can happen, but they still have to return back to their disenfranchisement. So, just finding ways to not only bridge that gap, but allow them the agency to articulate the changes that need to occur in the environment. Many of the tenants living near convalescent plants have had children for generations suffering from asthma. So, why not move, the dependency on the healthcare system, is fueling that complacency. And I think that thinking about individual responsibility and agency, specific conversations on my end, on the end of the community, have to take a peculiar shape.
And how do you see the role of people like yourself or Bard students in shaping that conversation? Is that something you aspire to do?
I think so. Being in Mississippi showed me the impact of contributing to efforts where they are, and how community leaders being able to kind of champion social justice and things like that. But I think making people realize things like revolution and human rights, like within their everyday, things as small as like being late or being upright, being honest, those things like that, I think will go a long way towards making them realize corruption and propaganda that's in their communities.
I think Yermina is the only one who's mentioned the free market. So I want everyone to just give me a quick speech. Let's start with you. What do you think about the free market?
Well, I think it's been at the foundation of our society for a long time, and I think when we think about things like free speech, something that we hold dear, and I think, at one glance, you see the opportunity to tap into a lot of ideas, and you see kind of endless opportunity in that way, but at the same time, think about what other ideas it limits. So I think it's a difficult kind of dance, I think, to have, and try to find what most effective resolution could come out of an engagement with the free market.
Steve?
I guess I'll say two things. One, I feel like the problem that I have with the free market is that it dictates to people a way of being in the world that is consumerism. That the free market works because the free market makes people buy things. At least in my understanding, and this, to the extent that this consumerism is perpetuated, I think it's part of, very much part of the large crises that we've been talking about. Is that there's sort of a need to consume in order to have some sort of identity. We very much identify with the things that we buy and consume, and take pride in that way. And I see myself just in my life being as little a participant in any kind of free market as possible. I buy books, and I'd like to not buy much more than that. So just being very aware of the things that I am buying that are produced by, the market, and knowing when it's something that I feel like I need to buy, and when it's something that I don't need to buy, and drastically reducing the amount of stuff that's in my life. And I feel like I've done that already by just not buying new clothes every year, and not buying the next new thing whenever it comes out. I have a pretty basic cell phone that I've had for 4 years, and I don't use it very often. I'm not planning to buy a new one when the next one comes out. It's just, and trying to make use of the things, buying as durable things as I can so that I don't need to then buy the next thing, not using any sort of disposable products. So just very much limiting the amount of stuff that I need to buy, I feel like is the way that I'm resisting consumer society that is driven by free market.
Okay, Zach.
Yeah, well, I'm not one of those, I don't put my entire belief system in the invisible hand of the free market. I think that, I'm also not one of those people that's diametrically opposed to capitalism. I think that in many respects it's run wild, and it has hurt us in many real ways. And I think that there are certain things that should be outside the purview of the free market or capitalism. And when we talk about human rights, I just always find it fascinating how we come about determining what are human rights, what aren't human rights. But personally, this is just my opinion. I think things like healthcare, for instance, the ability to get healthcare when you need it. If you get sick, I think the government, any government, should be able to provide the option of getting care for that.
And it's a question.
Yes.
Is there a limit to that?
Yes, there is a limit to that, and I think that is really the debate that's been going on for hundreds of years now, which is to what extent should the government be involved in our lives, and to what extent should government or the state help us in certain things. But I do think that there are certain aspects of our lives in terms of having good health care, for instance, or having the availability of health care for all people in a way that you don't go broke because you have to buy it from a private insurance company who, again, because we're working with capitalism, is looking to make the most amount of profit off of something. And so that's diametrically opposed to you and I being healthy, or for them serving our interests as healthy people. And that's why I think, so that is something that should lie outside of the free market. In terms of protecting our environment, making sure my water is clean and my air is clean so I don't get sick. Again, that should be outside the purview of the free market. So there are things that should lie outside of it, but like Stephen was saying, I also try to spend less because I think that consumerism and, I think people get caught up with it so much that we lose sight of who we are as people working with each other as people. And they're not, irreconcilable. Like, if you're a small business owner, you want to make a profit so that you want income to be coming in from your business so that you can get by and live. Now, it doesn't mean that small business owner, lacks any human affection or attachment from other people. He wants to make a profit at the end of the day, but he also has a family as well. But I think that we've been, unfortunately, moving more towards the side of consumerism in and of itself as a virtue and as a larger part in our lives. And I think that's dangerous because that makes us lose sight of who we are as individuals, working with each other as individuals, not because I want to make a profit from you. It's because I genuinely care about you and care about the future, our future together in society. So.
I think capitalism gets a lot more flack than it deserves. I think that there's something to be said about the sort of technology and the innovation that has come about through capitalism. I think there's also, I think it's almost as if some people feel that they're going to be happy if they buy the new iPad. I don't think there's any reason why they shouldn't. I think if people find consumerism as a way to attain happiness, I think by all means they should go ahead and do it. I think so. It's part of that freedom aspect, I suppose, freedom to get that sort of happiness that you so choose. On the other hand, I also think, especially in the United States, they make this dichotomy between the Goldman Sachs and Joe the plumber, and I think capitalism inherently doesn't make that distinction between the two. So this idea that when Steve Jobs dies, everyone's really sad, and how he is the epitome of capitalism, people forget. And so this idea, I think, is more to do with how capitalism is colored as opposed to what it actually means. Is I think something that people get wrapped in, because I think the only difference between a small scale and a large scale is only the scale. I think everyone wants to make a profit, and if everyone prefers, they'd like to make more profit. That in itself, I don't think is a bad thing, but I think it's what's really important is what that results in and how much that profit comes off of at other people's expense. I don't think capitalism caused the crisis. I think lack of regulation caused the crisis. I think any sort of business, regardless of whether it's banking, investment, or even, I don't know, even toys, it needs to be regulated in terms of how much damage does it pose to society and what are the potential damages that it can. And so I think it's not so much a question of the system, I think it's how that system is modeled and what is allowed and what is not. I think the idea of consumerism, I think is again a personal choice, and I think I would attribute a lot more individual responsibility to people buying things than it being thrust upon me. I don't think that even if I see 100 ads of, I don't know, what is it, Snuggies, I think if I see a day, I'm not going to buy one. So I think it's got a lot to do more with individual responsibility. As far as hurting society is concerned, yes, I think that's where the government needs to step in and make sure that the practices of capitalism don't cause more harm than good. So that's where I think it needs to be very heavily, in some cases, regulated, but I don't think inherently it's as bad as people suggest.
Can I answer to that really
Yes,
quickly?
please.
I mean, first of all, I think the I consume, therefore I am mentality is a bit more dangerous than you suggested, because I do think a lot of people substitute that sort of meaning and that sort of happiness for trying to, as we've talked about earlier, trying to think more deeply about the world and where their products come from, for example, and how that impacts the world at large. So I do think that is sort of used as a substitute, but you're right, we have to also take individual responsibility for not thinking about these things and for just consuming blindly or mindlessly. But secondly, I want to say I don't think innovation is always thrown around a lot when it comes to debates about capitalism and why it's such a good idea. And I don't think that's actually true. I don't think we just innovate because we want profit. I think we innovate for a lot of other reasons as well. It's just something that, if you want to say in our nature or something we enjoy, I don't know. But there are open source projects, for example, where people innovate or write computer programs that they'll never benefit from. They're just put out there for free on the internet for everyone to also rewrite and write their own little ideas too. Or people innovate for not-for-profit organizations, for the global south and for impoverished communities. We don't just innovate out of our, greed for profit in a way. And also, talking about capitalism, I think it's very important to get your definitions straight in a sense. I mean, it's not that if you're opposed to certain things that capitalism does, you're opposed to all sort of small business interactions or something. I think when we really talk about the big threats that capitalism poses, it's large-scale, like international corporations that are involved in a lot of different ways politically and also in, have a huge impact on our environment and the way, the world is being run. And also one thing that I don't think anyone has brought up yet is, even though there's a lot of impact on the environment and water and politics, I think also one thing that I'm very worried about with how a lot of these international large-scale corporations are run is the exploitation of workers. And where our cheap products are coming from is that a lot of the time, a lot of work is being outsourced into poorer countries and in the global south. And that's how we are building, our wealth over here, which we benefit from in some ways. We have to be more conscious of how much we do consume that comes from that sort of dynamic of exploitation. But again, it can only be changed if we have systematic change. It's not enough that I buy fair trade chocolate once in a while. I think it really needs to be that there needs to be tougher regulation on trade policy internationally.
It strikes me that one of the problems that you're all confronting is one that came back to the very first two comments by Beatrice and Irina when the issue of humanitarianism was raised. If you want to fight for some change in the world, whatever it's going to be, you know what the change is that you're going to fight for. And for those of you who are two human rights majors here, one of the ideas that we think about in the human rights program is how humanitarianism, in a sense, replaces other ideologies and other politics that have largely been discredited or people have lost faith in. And so it's sort of a least common denominator. And Beatrice defended it, I thought, interestingly and helpfully so. But I'm wondering, we have pragmatism, it's come up around the table in a certain sense, let's make it work, socialism, humanitarianism. anti-free market kind of socialism. I don't know if that's a fair way of characterizing.
I don't think it necessarily has to be socialism, but I do think a lot more regulation.
I'm wondering if people feel the lack. Does your generation face a crisis of the ideas? The lack of ideas that could motivate people to pursue a common project? I mean, even democracy, to a certain extent, has been questioned both by you and I think even by some of your comments, which, you know, I'm not trying, it's not at all critical. I think we're in a time in which democracies are in crisis. And I should have added that to my list at the beginning. Throughout Europe, here, elsewhere, people are really wondering if democracy can work in the modern world. And I'm wondering if you guys feel that loss of an idea you can believe in, or whether you have ideas that you believe in. So I want to start.
I mean, this is partly what my senior project is about, is because I'm writing about the idea of humanitarianism, which during this funding was always based on the idea of being apolitical, just alleviating suffering, no matter who the person is that's suffering, no matter what the context, no matter what their political leaning. And I think one reason why that idea, humanitarianism, has grown rapidly, like human rights recently, 70s, 80s, and up to now, is because we really like the idea of apolitical utopias. Because we have been, throughout the Cold War, and even now, we've been very disillusioned with politics and being able to make a real difference. So it sort of seems comforting to say, I'll donate some money, and I know some child in an impoverished nation is going to get food for today, or a blanket, or a shelter. And it's sort of comforting. We feel like some of the anxiety has been lessened because we are causing some sort of change, or at least can tell ourselves we are. But the problem is obviously that that is just putting a band-aid on a profusely bleeding wound or something. That's not actually gonna change the dynamics. And I think that's where the lack of ideas comes in. We don't really know how to affect the political system. It has become so complex.
Does that depress you?
It does. I think it does, because it seems so hard to really make a difference, because everything is so international. Even if we try, there's a feeling that even if we now change something about the way the US is run, China is going to overtake the political stage and then maybe pollute even more, or exploit, in their own way, or I don't know. So yeah, I think depression is definitely involved in hopelessness, but we have to keep fighting. That's what we do.
Does it depress you or not?
I think I'm more apprehensive. It makes me a little nervous to think about having to face the system maybe head on. I don't know, this idea of, when something says no, to make it say yes, it's already said no, kind of plagues me, and thinking about how disenfranchised communities can still believe in ideas of kind of liberation and freedom with a system that every day kind of hits them over the head with the same ideology is difficult. But I guess my hope is in, the small, very removed communities like Bard. I think, the special spaces where people can kind of get away from, that haze and kind of think deeply about change and ways to resolve a lot of the issues. I think that's what gives me hope. And then kind of entering back in that and grappling with those ideas with people who are facing them.
Zach, where do you? We have the hope of the small community, sort of despair, but we keep fighting. Where do you fit in on this?
I do have hope actually for the future. I think that at least and this is only within American society, it differs elsewhere, that we are a nation, we do have a progressive future. I think things have become more progressive in the sense that, consistently more people have been giving more rights and more liberty over the trajectory of our history. There was a time where we had slavery. That went away. Women couldn't vote. Women could vote. And right now, for instance, I think an example of this trajectory of progressivism in our country is the LGBT community, transgender, lesbian, gay people. And I think that there's every single generation in the future is more progressive than the one before it. And so that gives me hope. I think that, our generation overwhelmingly supports the rights of LGBT people compared to, people that are in the older generation right now. And because of that, I do have hope that that things will get better for the future. Will we solve all the problems? No. Will all the problems be solved in our lifetime? No. And there are certain things that might, economic conditions in the environment where there might be a foreboding presence of that in the future. But I think that we are naturally optimistic people who will, in small ways, make society better over time. And I think we have a natural track record history of doing that, and I think we'll continue to do that. So yes, I'm optimistic.
You want to jump in on this question?
I think that the sort of disillusionment that comes from political systems comes from how the political systems were sold to people. I think the sort of democracy promotion that the United States has, and especially over the past 20th century, as the end-all and be-all of any sort of political system, has been the problem. Where people go like, okay, we've got it now, and I think that's been a problem because you realize that you have systemic issues which come from politics. Like I think Congress being broken is part of being in a democracy. I mean, it's something the bipartisanship is an expected sort of result to come out of that, and so people get disillusioned with the sort of system that they have. And I think communism is very similar. I think communism was sold as the end-all and be-all during the Cold War, and the people that were, and the countries that were communist, I think, had the same sort of feeling, where they go like, okay, I'm in a line with about 5,000 people waiting for bread in the morning. I don't think I'm liking this very much. So I think the problem is, again, the way people thought about these sort of political systems and how the systems themselves were agents to provide happiness to the people living in those countries. So I think there was a very sort of basic understanding of what those systems mean and what they provide and what they fail to provide. So I think when it comes to humanitarianism, what humanitarianism, especially if you see it as an apolitical thing, I think it provides basic things which you don't have to think about in terms of ideology. But to know that, okay, you can say this, or you can not be starving, or you can, have clean water, or, you don't have to be slaughtered for your orientation. I think sexual orientation. I think, so what humanitarianism does is provides a platform for things for equity in your life to a certain extent, regardless of regardless of the political system that you're in. So it sort of supplements the sort of things that I think people thought that the political system would provide. And to that extent, I think the ideas are still there, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I just think that people need to think very hard about what those ideas mean for their lives and what they actually want out of those ideas, and not conflate that with like humanitarian stuff.
You want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess I think, like you asked, are we experiencing a crisis of ideas? And I think one thing that all of these issues are running up against is just how interrelated everything that's happening on this planet is, whether it's how the food that I consume affects the environment, or how the political actions that the U.S. takes affects international affairs, and economic collapse is affecting all these things. And we don't live in a time anymore where we can just sort of withdraw into a small community and have it exist and have its influence be contained somehow. It's and those kind of things, and I think the extent to which we raise awareness of how interrelated everything is, and where the things that surround us in our lives come from, and what history they have, will be like that's the attitude that'll help generate ideas. I think is if we face head on the fact that we're living on this planet that is so complicated interactions. We can't do anything anymore without it having consequences that are way beyond.
Is anyone not hopeful?
So while I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the greater trajectory of our values as people will improve, I am not hopeful in the sense that I think we institutions often procrastinate in dangerous ways. And like Simon was mentioning before, oil companies and energy companies and governments will, once they realize how dangerous the situation is, then they will act. Once they realize that water levels will rise and major cities will be so seriously affected by this, then we will act. And it's this procrastination that worries me. And I think that when push comes to shove, we will act because it'll be very dangerous, but we'll wait till the last second to do that. And it can be devastating.
It's the way it's been throughout history, hasn't it?
Yes.
Is it different now? Is the world more, in this interconnected way, is the world more dangerous than waiting till it ends?
Yeah, I mean, I think things are going to get a lot worse. I don't have any kind of hope, long-term hope in maintaining what we have. I think at some point in our past there was a tipping point of, and now we're headed in a direction that is not sustainable. And whether that's a question of population or a question of how much CO2 is in the atmosphere or what, I don't know where it is, but I think there's going to be a decline in what we might call standard of living or I think I don't have hope that we can sort of hit pause and like fix the problems that we have now and sort of continue in the sort of life that we have now, or I don't think we're going to be able to improve conditions in the same way as we've been able to improve conditions in the past 50 years. Anyway, I have a more sort of radical hope in that people will face these problems and that there's meaning in that.
Is that, in a sense, is that a common feeling amongst people at Bard?
I would disagree. I think that this is the first time that we're experiencing problems that hit countries at a global level. I think the Euro debt crisis is a very emblematic of that. And I think that the reluctance, especially of Germany, to do something about it is sort of indicative of how different things are now, where countries have to act for other countries. And this sort of thing is, I don't think any time has been seen before. And I think climate change, I think terrorism to an extent, and how the sort of most wars have been clothed as humanitarian intervention these days. I think most nation states are getting to grips with the fact that they can't act independently anymore. And I think it's tough, and I think a lot of people are making mistakes, the United States in particular. But I think there's some sort of collective learning to be gained from this. And I think especially college students at this point, I think, are seeing all of this and knowing that things will definitely be different, and the sort of character that most crises will take will definitely have an international character to it from now on. And I think once people learn how to grapple with these kind of issues in particular, these kind of crises in particular, I think we can be hopeful about the fact that there has to be more cooperation in the future, because the alternative is just non-existent. So I think countries right now are just coming to grips with the fact that they live in a very, very globalized world. And while it's messy, this process of getting to grips with it is messy. I think that it's the only option in the future.
I mean, I agree with that, but I also agree with Zach that the point at which we will learn is going to be very last minute. And I wonder if the world will not look very different once we learn. And I mean, that's where I hope that maybe the crisis of ideas is going to end in some ways, that this crisis is going to provide an open space for new ideas to emerge of how to structure this corporation that is desperately needed, I agree. But I think it is only going to come about in a moment of absolute desperation, last minute. And I have hope that after that we can maybe move on to a different sort of corporation that is going to, a different, like a world that is going to look different. But I'm also hopeless in the sense that I think it's going to happen. So, yeah. last minute when things are already the heavens are about to fall.
Let me ask a personal question to some of you. Personal. I don't know. I guess in 2011, somewhere around 85% of college students who graduated moved back in with their parents. There's a new term, I don't know how many of you have heard it, called emerging adulthood, which the New York Times Magazine did a story on this year. I guess sociologists say that the transition to adulthood, it comes from completing school, leaving the home, becoming financially independent, marrying, and having a child. In 1960, 77% of women and 65% of men had reached adulthood, by that sociological definition, by the time of 30. In 2000, fewer than half women and only 1/3 of the men had done so. And so there seems to be a sense that there's this new sociological trend called emerging adulthood that, you know, is in somewhere around the 20s. I'm wondering if that's something you guys agree with, and if you think it's something to embrace or to be worried about.
I definitely don't agree with the idea that living with one's parents means that they haven't emerged into adulthood, especially when you just think sensibly about rent. I mean, it doesn't make it. I mean, living with your parents doesn't mean you won't still engage in the same adult like behaviors. I mean, obviously space plays a role in that, but I think that that's one thing I definitely take issue with. I don't condemn that idea. But I do think that, I don't know, as I look towards my adulthood, being able to remain critical in an intellectually engaged environment for as long as possible, I think is important just because of the nature of the world in which we live in now. So I think that getting an education and making sure that one's horizons are as broad as they can be before kind of saying, okay, now I'm ready to. I think if in the past members of our country, the world society were doing that, I think we'd have a different discussion today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, American society doesn't really have a way to think about children becoming adults and yet still living in their home. And I think that it would be important to develop that, because I think that idea that somehow you aren't an adult if you're still living in the home with your parents is problematic. And while I understand that, providing a home for yourself is very much a part of being an adult, and if your parents are still paying the taxes or they're paying the mortgage or whatever, in some sense you're not fully taking on the responsibilities of living. But I think especially with student debt, there was a article in the Times a while ago about how its focus was how all of these college students moving back in with their parents is a really bad thing for the economy, because they aren't going and buying all the furniture and paying their rent, and they're doing what they have to do to make ends meet. And I think that's it shouldn't be a given that when you leave college you go buy a house and start over, kind of. I think that actually has perpetuated a lot of the problems, especially economic problems that we have, is this idea that part of being an adult is buying a new house and buying all of your stuff to fill your house, and instead of making do with a perfectly good house that you grew up in, and engaging in the community where you grew up and being a full member of that space. That personally, that's something that I feel more attracted to. Whether I move in with my parents after I graduate or not, I want to go back to my home community and be an adult there, because I was a child there, and I want to be an adult in that same space and learn what that means.
I think it's really interesting, because I think that this sort of emerging adulthood, the concept of emerging adulthood, is yes part sociological, but also in terms of economics. I think that we've in terms of the age that people get married now. 40 years ago, people would get married. It was the norm to get married when you were 21 or 22. You graduate college, you get married, you have kids very early on. And that has slowly moved up for both men and women. Now we're like in the late 20s, early 30s is the norm now. And that's sort of been a progression of, I want to, graduate college, I want some freedom, I want to explore different things, I want to travel, I don't want to be settled down yet. And I don't know necessarily what the causes of that are, but it is a reality. And then also, I think that the economy is rough right now, and people don't have the luxury to graduate and have a great job waiting for them. And I think that also a lot of people in our generation have the expectation, because you go to high school, for a lot of people, they're expected to go to college, they apply to college, they're great students, they get into college, they do well, you graduate college, and then all of a sudden it's, wait a second, I have to make the decision now for myself. And I think unfortunately a lot of people are ready to make that decision, a lot of people are not ready to make that decision. And it's unfortunate for those that don't really know what they want to do at this point. And everything's been structured up until now. Many of us are seniors, we're graduating very soon. We have to make that decision for ourselves. But in terms of economics, there's just not many opportunities for a lot of people right after they graduate. In terms of good opportunities where I can have a job where I get paid decently enough that I could live on my own, for instance. And that there's just realistically a lack of that. And that necessitates living with your parents, which I can almost guarantee you both sides, the parents and the student that's moving in, probably do not like the situation. It's mutual. But there's an acknowledgement that, hopefully this is temporary, and hopefully things will improve and I can be independent. But, and actually, interestingly, I think that making the decision, you go to college and then living with your parents again, is a very responsible decision, actually, right? Because a lot of people probably don't like the thought of that, but the fact that they're willing to do that, to make ends meet for the time being, is actually a very responsible thing to do, whether or not you like it. But
Do our two international students have different opinions on this? I'm just wondering if there's a different way it's viewed internationally.
Very much so. If you graduate from college, one, you're required to live with your parents for the rest of your life. Not because you're supposed to take care of them when they grow old. And if you're the man, then you're supposed to bring your wife into that house as well. So there's always the flight of the bride to the house, and especially the meeting of the in-laws. It's a big thing. Apart from that, even economic freedom is something which isn't granted because after you graduate from college, because you're supposed to be working with your father, whatever he is doing. So in a way, apart from being simply your dad, he also becomes your boss. And that is prevalent until the day he dies. So independence, whether it be economic or in general, isn't something which is looked upon favorably in any case once somebody graduates. Even the idea of graduating is something fairly new. I think going to college is something that wasn't... I think it's similar to the US, because college wasn't as big a deal, say, 50 years ago as it is now.
Will it be hard for you to go back into that world, or do you plan?
I don't plan to do that at all.
You don't plan to do that?
But I don't plan on staying in one place either. I think my parents don't buy into that, but everyone around me does, so I'm very well acquainted with it. And so, I think, again, I keep harping on about individual responsibility, but I feel like it's very important to think about what you want out of life as opposed to ascribe to these ideas of, marriage or job or anything. I mean, if somebody doesn't want a job, they don't want a job. If somebody doesn't want to get married, they don't want to get married. And I think everybody has the freedom to decide for themselves. In any, weird, fantastical pictures that I have of myself in the next 10 years, I don't imagine myself with a wife or a kid or a house or driving to work or any of that. I don't know what is there, but I know that that's not it. So any sort of traditional or conventional ways of looking at adulthood is something that I don't necessarily ascribe to. I might pick something out of it, I might like a job. But that's not because I think that that's what I should be doing. I think this idea of what somebody should be doing as an adult, and especially when new terms come about, again, I'm very skeptic of accepting those terms and sort of normalizing them. And so I've seen that other side as well, because I think in both cultures, back home and over here, there are very specific ideas of what being an adult means, and I don't necessarily subscribe to either of them.
Do you have something to add?
Yes, I mean, Germany is definitely a bit closer to the US model, but on the other hand, it's also a bit more, it feels a bit more secure still, because we have more benefits. So if you try and move out as a young adult, or if I would try and now pursue a doctorate there, I would still get state support. So in that sense, I could probably have an easier time affording my own rent or something else. But obviously, who knows for how long, with the Euro crisis now in full swing. But another thing I just find is, especially when it comes to having your own family, that being one of the requirements for being a full adult, is because I feel like our generation is feeling so insecure somehow about the future and feel like it's a very unstable place. We don't really know where it's going. It seems like a very scary decision to bring another life into this world and not know if you can still provide for a child, because you don't know how the job situation is going to look like. You don't know if you're going to be able to pay for healthcare or for education. It's a scary choice, I think, for a lot of young people.
Is that something a lot of you are thinking a lot about whether you can afford to bring a child into the world? Is bringing a child into the world something you do when you can afford it? Is it something you do as an act of hope or faith? Is it something you do because what else would you do? Or is it a rational choice? And is it becoming a more and more irrational choice? I guess is there anything else suggesting? Is this something, I mean, you guys can tell me you're just not thinking about it.
I'm thinking about it. And it's, I guess I haven't thought about it in economic terms as much in the sort of terms I think you were saying of what would it mean to bring a new person into this world who's going to be growing up in what will most likely be a mess. And do I feel comfortable with myself doing that? From a purely selfish perspective, I would have a kid because I want to learn what it means to have a kid. I think that would probably be the greatest educational experience I would have is how do I bring a new person into the world? The question is how to balance that desire to be oriented to the world in that way and reoriented to the world in that way with the concern for the child's well-being in a world that's a mess. And I guess now I'm today, or I'm leaning on in the past while I'm leaning towards the hope that newness brings, and that whether or not the world's a mess, there's still something meaningful about engaging in the world that way.
I asked the question a slightly different way. I heard Martin Scorsese say the other day that he was asked what advice he would give to a young aspiring filmmaker, and he said, well, for a man, I would say get married as soon as possible, because when I got married, it put me under a huge amount of responsibility to have a living and do work, and it really spurred me to work. And he said, for a woman, stay single as long as possible. And obviously, he was representing a certain gender dynamics. I'm wondering if that enters your calculations as well. But I don't know.
I'd say yes, a bit. I think it's something that's to be considered, definitely. Just because of the economic commitment that goes into being married and the expectations for that, and as a student, taking on student loans and then the just economic responsibilities of adulthood. It's an interesting position to consider, especially when you think about how mobile you want to be and what it means to have to take another person along with you. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that it's but I think it's the same for both genders in the sense that it's harder in a more global world where you really have to move around to find maybe a job that you like or that is stable, to bring your family along, especially when your partner also is working, in that sense. But also I wanted to say one other thing about the child and this idea is that I don't think it's really an economic decision. decision for me, but I think that is the thing that makes the decision more scary. The idea of that the future isn't as stable anymore. But I agree with both of you that in a sense it's an act of faith, and we need an act of faith. And sort of, I mean, that's the idea of Arendt as well, that she believes salvation lies in the idea of ultimatality, bringing in the new, that will be able to create something completely new and create hope.
So I want to actually end by a question on creating hope, just like you said, and I'll give you all a chance to respond to it. As many of you know, Hannah Arendt writes that courage is the first political virtue, since all political action requires that you risk leaving the comfort of your private sphere and your family and your work and your job and actually enter a world where you might be criticized, where you might be killed, where you might be, you might have your reputation besmirched. It requires a certain courage to have a child, maybe even today, as an act of faith. I'm wondering whether you think Bard breeds courage in students, and what would you hope to do courageously in the next year or two of your lives? Does anyone want to take a crack at that?
Well, I mean, on the question of whether Bard breeds courage, and I'd definitely say yes. I think a lot of nights just walking on the dark, unlit back path. I think of, I forget where, but someone saying courage in French, and that's kind of how I get from, the admissions office to the gym back to my room. So in that, it's definitely something to think about as I, start to study, and as I think about the next step after graduation. But in terms of doing something courageous and stepping outside of one's private comfortable space, it's difficult to say this is the trail that I'd like to blaze, just because metaphysically, if you don't get there, and how that proclamation influences whether or not you get there. It's hard for me to say, like, this is the trail I want to blaze, but I think I know that in 20 years I'd like to look back retrospectively and say, I've done something with my Bard education, and not just said that I got one. Yeah.
I wish that there was an English equivalent for the French bon courage, because you say that to people in French-speaking places, in bon courage, and I've tried to sort of anglicize it, usually in the context of like homework and papers and but I think it's an interesting question. Does Bard breed courage? Because I think it's something you can't teach, but it's something that can be sort of part of an environment. And I feel like Bard, for me, has inspired a commitment to the world, and I sort of have to, and responsibility, and it's sort of up to me to match that with my courage. And I guess Bard has drawn that out of me by challenging me and having me confront all of these ideas that that are challenging ideas and that I could not think about, but something about the environment that we have makes me committed to thinking about them, and then in order to do that I need to be courageous. So I guess that's how I see it.
Not sure. So I would say yes, I do believe Bard breeds courage, but it's not necessarily something that is bred while we are here, necessarily. I think that, 10, 15, 20 years from now, or even later, we're going to look back at Bard and say, what, all the values that we have, whether it's our educational values or looking at life in general in a new way of analyzing things, interacting with people, that is courageous, and I think that our future paths will reflect. Well, once you reflect on Bard, we'll realize that it did breed a sort of courage, a personal courage that's unique to each of us because of our time here. And I think you asked like what courageous things can we do right after Bard necessarily. I say do something that you feel uncomfortable doing, but that can have a real impact to people. But do something completely new that is not conventional. This is the time to do it. This is really because we were talking about adulthood later on, earlier, and once that kicks in, it's hard to be more unconventional. It's hard to be more courageous in different ways in your life. So this is really, I think Bard does instill that value, and I would say do something courageous right after Bard. That this is the time to do it.
I work at the Phonathon at Bard, and part of that is calling people who have just graduated and asking them for money, and it's generally created some very awkward conversations. I've called people that are gardeners that are struggling. I've called people that work at Port Authority. I've called people that, as a cashier, I've called people that line up at a talent agency in Hollywood every morning to offer their services as a scriptwriter and then go back home every day. And so while that might not get the most amount of cash that I think Bard would hope out of their alumni, the one thing that was the most incredible thing of all out of that to me was how the amount of courage it took for those students to decide that this is what they want to do. And I think that's the most courageous thing of all, and I think there's something about the Bard education that allows people to think that way and know that these are the consequences of my actions, of the sort of things that I'll be studying, of the things that I want to do in this life. But I think the fact that they make that decision consciously, knowing those consequences, and are comfortable with that decision is something I don't see everywhere, something which I think has very much to do with the sort of education that somebody at Bard would receive. Because this idea of how success is delineated from any sort of job, I think it's a very courageous thing, well, for one Bard to teach, and then for students to actually believe that. And I think in that way, I think it's very courageous that those students who've just graduated have these ideas about the things that they want to do and are doing that, on their terms, no matter what the world or the real world or whatever you want to call it throws at them. And I think in that sense, yes, I think Bard students are more courageous than I think any other.
I actually feel that Bard has taught me to be courageous even while being here, because it has taught me to actually take serious some things that society at large deems very useless, and as if I couldn't do anything of that sort of education. So the idea of finding meaning in art or literature or idealism that I want to carry with me outside into the real world. And even though we might not always be able to choose what our occupation is and how we gonna support ourselves, I really want to take this sort of quest for meaning with me, and not just because I know the overwhelming majority of students after they graduate, if they're lit majors, they barely will ever discuss a novel again, or will ever paint a picture if they're actually art majors. But I think Bard actually made me feel good about taking that with me out into the real world and to keep on doing that, because I got so much meaning out of it while being here, and that makes me feel very courageous.
Well, that's great. I think the only thing missing from this table is food and drink. Bard is supposed to be the best dinner party school in the country, according to the Onion. And I have to say that it would be really fun to have this dinner party on a regular basis. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I wish you all great luck, so thank you all for participating with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.